The next to last day of early voting had lines wrapped around buildings in some locations in New Hanover County. Early voting ends tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. The state's elections director said today voters have showed up in record numbers ahead of Election Day on Tuesday. WECT's Ava Brengord talked to some elections officials and voters today. Now, Ava, it's just amazing to believe that half of the registered voters in this state have already cast their ballots.
Yeah, that's right, John. Data from the State Board of Elections shows more registered Republicans, 1.3 million, have used early voting than Democrats or unaffiliated voters. Tonight, we're getting a closer look at the numbers ahead of Election Day.
There you go.
As early voting draws to a close, the lines to get to the polls are growing.
I don't know how long it's going to take.
Only about 20 minutes. It really hasn't been too bad.
State Board of Elections officials say the lines in New Hanover County reflect the record-breaking numbers across the state, with nearly 3.7 million voters casting their ballots early and in person so far.
We cruised past the record set in 2020.
The state's top election official, Karen Brinson-Bell, says over 4 million ballots have been cast statewide. That's over half of the state's registered voters. Over in the western part of the state, a surprising twist.
Voter turnout in the 25 Helene disaster counties continue to outpace voter turnout statewide.
Brinson-Bell says voters there aren't letting the storm keep them from the polls.
We are very proud of the resilient and strong people of Western North Carolina.
Back home, the lines seem to be growing by the minute.
When I drove by, the line was way up there, but by the time I found a parking spot, it grew tremendously.
But voters say that's not going to stop them.
I think it would be a disservice not to vote.
Polling places will be open until 7:30 tonight and until 3 p.m. on Saturday. Remember, you can go to any polling location in the county where you're registered during early voting.
Now, Ava, we do need to remind viewers about the change in when the ballots cast in early voting will actually be counted by elections officials.
Right, John. Previously, county boards of elections could count those early voting ballots before the polls close on Election Day. A new change to state law this year says the county boards must wait until 7:30 p.m. to begin to tabulate early voting ballots. This means we're going to have to wait a little bit longer before we see the unofficial early voting results on election night.
Yeah, we used to get those numbers a minute or two after the precincts closed, and now it may be more like 30 to 35 minutes is what they're saying on Election Day, which is Tuesday, November the 5th. Ava, appreciate the update. Thanks. Now, there